Good evening, everyone. My name is Robert Latham, and today I've decided to make a short video to explain the differences in the original source manuscripts that we have regarding the height of Goliath. And the reason I'm making this video is because I posted a comment in the context of a group conversation regarding the reliability of Ellen White's writings, and how the conversation went is that we should be studying for ourselves, not only relying on what Ellen White has to say. And so I chipped in and I said, based on the research that I've done on these texts for several months, I've become convinced of quite a few things which are different to what Ellen White has written. And so I shared an example to do with the height of Goliath, and one or two people were quite interested in what I shared. And so I've got all of my original sources here with me, all of my books, and I've decided to make this short video just to explain these variations with regards to the height of Goliath. Dear Father in heaven, I pray that the Holy Spirit would guide the rest of this presentation. In Jesus' name, Amen. Okay, so I'll first show you the quotes from Ellen White to see what she has to say about this. Sorry, I'm charging my phone at the same time, so the cord has its limit. Okay, so this first reference, this is from Ellen White's writings, is from The Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 1, page 370, paragraph 1. And in this quote, she's talking about David and Goliath, and she says that Goliath was about 12 feet tall. Now, this has been referenced in SDA Bible Commentary, Volume 2, page 1018, paragraph 5, where it quotes The Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 1, page 370, which I just read. Goliath is about 12 feet tall. The Philistines proposed their own manner of warfare in selecting a man of great size and strength whose height is about 12 feet. So, this first statement, which is referenced in two different references, she writes that Goliath was 12 feet tall. But in another statement, which she made later, this is from the Signs of the Times, August the 10th, 1888, paragraph 1. She says that he was 10.5 feet tall. For 40 days, the host of Israel had trembled before the haughty challenge of Goliath, the Philistine giant. Their hearts failed within them as they looked upon his massive form, measuring 6 cubits in the span, or 10.5 feet. So in one quote, Ellen White says that Goliath was 12 feet tall, and in another quote, she says that he was 10.5 feet tall. And neither of these, I've come to the conclusion that neither of these is actually correct. Obviously, they both can't be correct. You can't be 12 feet tall and 10.5 feet tall at the same time. So at least one of those quotes has to be wrong. And I've come to the conclusion, based on months of prayer and research, that both of the quotes are wrong, and Goliath was actually a lot shorter than 12 feet tall. Now, this is the New King James Version of 1 Samuel 17. Like all Bibles, this text right here is an English translation of the Masoretic text, which is the traditional Hebrew text of the Old Testament. And by the way, the oldest version of the Masoretic text that we have today in existence is from around the 11th century AD. So around 11 centuries after Jesus is the oldest Hebrew text. And this is what all of our Bibles are translated from. Ever since around the 4th century AD, we started using the Hebrew text. as opposed to the Greek text. I'll get onto that in a minute. So anyway, in 1 Samuel 17, it's verse 4, it says, "A champion went out from a camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span." So a cubit is, this is the Hebrew cubit, which is 18 inches tall, and a span, by the way, is half a cubit. In case you are not aware, a cubit is the distance between your elbow and your fingertip. So the distance between the elbow and the fingertip is a cubit, and a span is exactly half of a cubit. So 6 cubits and a span is like saying 6.5 cubits. And when you use the Hebrew cubit of 18 inches, if you do 18 multiplied by 6.5, you get to, I believe, 81 cubits. I'm doing this from memory, not working it out in my head, but I think it's 81 inches, and 81 inches is 9 feet 9 inches. So, according to the Masoretic text itself, even Ellen White's quote of this number isn't actually correct, because 6 cubits and a span doesn't actually mean either. It doesn't mean 12 feet, and it doesn't mean 10.5 feet. It actually means 9 feet 9. And here, in the footnotes, they've said as much here in this study Bible. The cubit was about 18 inches, and a span was 9 inches. Thus Goliath stood at 9 feet 9 inches tall. So even in the study Bible, they've identified, they've translated into like modern measurements for us, 9 feet 9 inches. That's what this text is saying. And Ellen White's quotation of this text is different. And my conclusion, just on this alone, and we haven't even gone to the original sources, to the older sources yet, but my conclusion from this alone is that Ellen White did not have a divine revelation on Goliath's height, but she was merely referring to the scholars of her day who didn't understand what a cubit was. Because this figure is not 12 feet, and it's not 10.5 feet either. It's 9 feet 9 inches, and that tells me that the scholars of Ellen White's day didn't understand the measurement system properly, and Ellen White quoted from them, and she used that height in her quotations. But it's wrong, because 10.5 feet and the other quotation, 12 feet, which are both different from one another, are not the same as 9 feet 9, but it actually is. But like I said, I believe that Goliath was actually a lot shorter than that. So when we think about the original source texts, this is a translation from a Masoretic text, which is just one source. But there's 3 other sources that say he was 4 cubits and a span, not 6 cubits and a span. So this is my New King James Version. I'm just putting it off to the side. Next, I'm going to show you my English translation of the Septuagint text. This is from the Orthodox Study Bible, which is from a Greek Orthodox church, and it's an amazing translation. I just love this Bible so much. It's just so amazing. I couldn't recommend it highly enough. But anyway, this is the equivalent of 1 Samuel 17, 1 Kingdoms 17, in the translation of the Septuagint. And verse 4 says, "And a mighty man went out from the battle line of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath. His height was 4 cubits and a span." So, 4 cubits and a span. So this is witness number 1, the Septuagint, 4 cubits and a span. Witness number 2 is the text of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now I've got this Bible here. You can get this on Amazon. It's the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible, the oldest known Bible translated for the first time into English. And I'd recommend that you buy this on Amazon. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, just to give an overview, they were first discovered in 1947, which of course, as you can realise, is at least 30 years plus after Ellen White died. 32 years after Ellen White's death, they were discovered. And it took around 50 years for them to all get translated and stuff. And this is the various fragments put together and translated for us. Some passages are very fragmented, like Proverbs only has a couple of verses preserved. And some are very well preserved, like Isaiah. Isaiah is very well preserved along the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls date back to the time of Jesus. 2,000 years old are the age of those scrolls, and they're worth millions of pounds. So here is 1 Samuel 17, and I can just read this opening quote. This is an explanatory text, an explanation note on the text. It reads, "The next passage illustrates how ancient narratives sometimes grew at the hand of narrators or scribes. 4Q Sam A, and by the way, that's the name of this manuscript from which this is translated. 4Q Sam A is Qumran Cave number 4, the text of Samuel, copy A, which is the first copy of the book of Samuel from the cave 4 in Qumran. That's the name of this manuscript. So this manuscript gives the height of Goliath as 4 cubits, equaling about 6 feet. And this is what the original Septuagint, which we already read, followed by the historian Josephus, which I'm about to share with you afterwards, also records. When it talks about how the Septuagint itself started inflating the number 5 cubits and 6 cubits, about 9 feet. So anyway, here, from verse 4, "Then a champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of Philistine camp. His height was 4 cubits and a span." So text number 1 was the Septuagint, which says his height was 4 cubits and a span. That's from a Septuagint. Text 2 from the Dead Sea Scrolls, 4 cubits and a span. Next is Josephus. I've got it here. This is the works of Josephus, translated by Winston, I believe. Yeah, William Winston. I've got it here. Hang on. Got a bit of paper in the way. It's awkward when you're holding the phone in one hand and trying to do this. Whoops. Yeah, like that. That's what it is. Josephus was a 1st century Jewish historian. So again, this writing is as old as the time of Christ, really. So this is from the Antiquities of the Jews, chapter 9, and it's on the story of David and Goliath. And it says, I'll start reading from about here. "Now there came down a man out of the camp of the Philistines, whose name was Goliath, of the city of Gath, a man of vast bulk, for he was of 4 cubits and a span in tallness." So we've got these 3 witnesses here. We've got the works of Josephus. It says he was 4 cubits and a span. We've got the Dead Sea Scrolls saying he was 4 cubits and a span, and we've got the Septuagint, which says he was 4 cubits and a span. Now when you work it out, with a cubit being 18 inches, you do 18 multiplied by 4.5, gives you that number of inches, and you work it out, and it's 6 feet 9 inches tall. So based on these 3 witnesses, I'm convinced that Goliath was less than 7 feet tall. And in this particular instance, I have to disagree with what Ellen White says. I don't believe he was 12 feet tall. I don't believe he was 10.5 feet tall. I don't believe he was 9 feet 9 inches tall, like our traditional text says. I believe, according to the Septuagint text, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the writings of Josephus, that Goliath was 6 feet 9 inches. So, and when you believe that Goliath was 6'9", it actually makes the story more believable, and you can relate to it in a much better way. Now I've got some other stuff to share with you on the text of David and Goliath, but I'll first just mention to you that in the case of 1st and 2nd Samuel, I've come to the conclusion that our Masoretic text is quite unreliable, and that the Septuagint and Dead Sea Scrolls provide this double witness as to what the true reading actually is. There's quite a few places where it reads differently, and I believe that these alternative sources are a much better source text for our Bibles. Now let me share this quotation from you. This book, I got this book on Amazon. You should buy it too. It's an amazing book. Rabbi Akiba's Messiah by Daniel Gruber. Buy this book. It's amazing. This is about the Jews at the conclusion of the first century, after they had rejected Jesus and came under the full control of Satan and wanted to overthrow the whole authority that God had given in the Old Testament to establish themselves as the authority. And the Pharisees became the rabbis, and the rabbis changed the whole form of Judaism. They changed the whole religion from what God gave in the Old Testament to rabbinical Judaism, which has a few differences. And they also standardized the text of Scripture. Listen to this. The standardization of the text, to whatever extent that occurred, offered an opportunity for those doing the standardizing to choose those variations which were most in accord with their own beliefs. It then led to seeing that all other versions were eliminated. It is not likely that this was an impartial, disinterested exercise. The rabbis and their followers were a minority sect seeking power. In their reasoning and in their determination of binding law, they freely changed the text they kept. So, you know, this is a history. This is an amazing book if you want to learn about the real history of what happened at the end of the first century, because this book here explains how Satan controlled the rabbis that had full control of the Hebrew text of the Old Testament. And when you really consider it, at the end of the first century AD, the rabbis had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to change the Bible. To basically water down the prophecies about Jesus, because the Christians were using the Septuagint, which proved that Jesus is the Messiah. There was this beautiful prophecy, for example, in Psalm 40, which describes the Messiah as having a human body. He's like, come in the volume of the book you have prophesied of me, lo, a body you have prepared for me. And that's how it's quoted in Hebrews 10, verses 5 to 7. But in our version of Psalm 40, it says, in place of a body you have prepared for me, it actually says, my ears you have opened. So they changed the text. They changed the prophecy because they didn't like the fact that the Christians had a Bible which proved that the Messiah would be a human being. So they changed what the wording was. Anyway, that's just one example. I've got around like 20 examples I could show you, but I don't want to make this video too long. But through researching this for months and months, it's just become intensely interesting. So anyway, let me go back to what I was going to show you on 1 Samuel. This is in the same book. Let me read 2 paragraphs from here. Though Ginsburg is probably correct in his estimation of Akiba's motivation, his phrasing of the issue is inaccurate. First, from our perspective today, we can speak of errors and inaccuracies in the Septuagint. That's the Greek translation of the Old Testament. But that is because we have had almost a fixed, standardized text for many centuries. That was not the case in the first century. There were many variants in circulation in the first century, and no received text by which to judge all the others. There was no accepted standard by which to judge the Septuagint, or any other version. In fact, the Septuagint was probably the text used by more Jews than any other. Second, there is a reason to believe that in some cases the Septuagint is more accurate than the Masoretic, Orlinsky points out as an example, the Septuagint of Samuel not only fails to coincide with our preserved so-called Masoretic text, but is often clearly superior to it. So here's a Jewish scholar who says that the Septuagint of Samuel, that's 1st and 2nd Samuel, in this Bible, the Septuagint, is far more accurate than what we have here in the New King James Version, for our translation of the Masoretic text. Get this book, it will change your life. I'd just like to identify a couple of other things in the story in 1 Samuel. This is no longer on the height of Goliath, we've covered that. Goliath was less than 7 feet tall. But it's got some really nice textual variations. So let me read a bit to you. From verse 21. And when Goliath saw David, he disdained him, for he was a young boy, ruddy, with a good countenance. So the Philistine said to David, Am I as a dog, that you come against me with a staff and stones? Then David said, No, worse than a dog. And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. This phrase here, where David says, No, worse than a dog, is not in our text. It's not in our traditional text. But here in the Septuagint account of the story, David has this amazing comeback at Goliath. And the amazing thing is, that phrase, no worse than a dog, is supported by what Josephus says of the accounts. This is going back to Josephus's writings. Josephus has the same thing here, where Josephus reports the exact same wording, where David said, no, you're worse than a dog. So it's just fascinating. Now some people have criticised the Septuagint for having only 33 verses in 1 Samuel, where we have 58 verses, and but basically the accusation is, how could this version be right when there's only 33 verses, and in the New King James, translated from a Masoretic text, there's 58 verses? How come 20 verses are missing? Did they take it out? And the answer is no, they didn't take it out, they added it. The original, I think this is the original, only with 33 verses. The extra verses, when you study both versions, are basically about David's lineage, that David, was the son of Jesse, and etc., etc. Let me read to you how 1 Samuel ends from the New King James Version, which is a translation of our traditional Hebrew text. This is quite an interesting thing to discover. So, this is from verse 55. This is right at the end of the episode with David and Goliath. It says, When Saul saw David going out against the Philistine, he said, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, As your soul lives, O king, I do not know. So the king said, Inquire whose son this young man is. Then as David returned from the slaughter of a Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul, with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, Whose son are you, young man? And David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. So, I think that this whole bit here is added. It's not original. It's all added. 3 times here we've got the question. Basically, Saul does not know who David is. Saul has no idea who David is. It says, whose son is this youth? Inquire whose son this young man is. Whose son are you, young man? Saul doesn't know who David is, according to this passage at the end of 1 Samuel 17. But when you go back one chapter to the end of chapter 16, it says, Therefore Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, Send me your son David. Now this is in quotation marks. Send me your son David. So how can he say here, send me your son David, and then over here, which is chronologically afterwards, he then says, whose son is this? He's like, he doesn't even know who David is. And as someone said, you know, did the king have brain surgery between chapter 16 and chapter 17? Where here, he doesn't know who David is. But just in the previous chapter, he not only knows who David is, but David becomes his special favourite armour bearer. It says, so David came to Saul and stood before him, and he loved him greatly, and became his armour-bearer. So David became Saul's special armour-bearer, his special servant. And then Saul sent to Jesse, saying, please let David stand before me, for he has found favour in my sight. So here we've got Saul talking to David's father about David, and that David has found this special favour in the sight of Saul, so David, should stand before Saul and become his special armour-bearer. This whole passage clearly says that Saul knew who Jesse was, Saul knew who David was, and Saul greatly loved and favoured David. But this passage here, just at the end of the next chapter, basically says that Saul doesn't know who David is, and Saul has no idea who he is, and so he's asking about David's lineage. And the commentary says as much. Whose son is this youth? How does this question fit with the fact that David had been serving as a musician in Saul's court? Saul's unstable mental condition may have affected his memory. Saul may have recognized David as his court musician but forgotten the name of David's father. So this, they're just speculating about how we can get around this contradiction. But, when we use the Septuagint text, going back to my beloved Septuagint Bible, this whole account basically doesn't exist in the Septuagint, which is bold proof that the Jews added it. They added it to prove that David. I think the Jews, the scribes, were just trying to emphasize that David, is the son of Jesse. He's through him comes the Messiah, etc. But it's not the original text. The Septuagint is the original text. And so I believe that David didn't ask. I believe that Saul didn't ask about David's identity at the end of 1 Samuel. And so, going back to the original thing I showed you from Ellen White's writings, later in this article, where's my mouse? Don't even know where my mouse is. Do you ever have this experience? Oh, here we are. So, here we are. So somewhere in here, Ellen White basically says the same as the Masoretic text. Let me just try to find it. Here we are. First paragraph of the next article. Signs of the Times, August 17, 1888, paragraph 1. Ellen White says, after the slaying of Goliath, David was brought before King Saul, and the king inquired concerning his parentage and life. I don't believe that Saul did inquire after his parentage and life. I believe from a Septuagint text that he didn't. And I believe that what Ellen White is doing here, she's basically just repeating what is in our Bibles already. She's just repeating what this says. That's all Ellen White is doing. She's just repeating this. And my conclusion is that Ellen White is only as good as our Bible is. And because she is subject to this, our real question should be on the accuracy of this, and I believe we need to compare it with this, and with this, and with this, in order to have the right reading. So, I disagree with Ellen White. I believe that Goliath was less than 7 feet tall, and I do not believe that Saul asked about David's lineage at the close of 1 Samuel 17. And that's my conclusion after having done a lot of research on this. But this is not the only thing I found which is mind-blowing. If I were to go through the chronology of Genesis 11, it would blow your minds, because I believe the Earth is older than 6,000 years. I think we're at least 7,300 years old. That is on the age of the Earth. Yeah, the more you study the original textual variations, it's so gripping. You'll never look back. It's a study that for me, it just fills my mind, because for me, these variations in the text are an illustration of the great controversy. Because when you read in the Septuagint how various prophecies about the Messiah, they're a lot stronger. They're a lot stronger saying who the Messiah is. And in the Masoretic text, they're kind of watered down. So this whole study has led me into a really deep study about the messianic prophecies in the Old Testament in the Septuagint text, in comparison with what we have in the Masoretic text. And it's even led me to reevaluate that taboo subject of the Apocrypha. I'm revisiting it. I'm reading it for myself. I'm coming to my own conclusions, and I'm coming to some unique conclusions, different to Catholics, different to Protestants. I'm coming to my own conclusions on the Apocrypha based on my own study, and it's a fascinating study. But anyway, if I continue going, I could go for two extra hours. I want to just give you this short video just about the height of Goliath, and I pray that you've been blessed by it. God bless, and have a good night.